A lonely mother kept her porch light on for years, believing her soldier son would someday walk back down the road by the lake. But one quiet afternoon, a Navy SEAL and his German shepherd arrived at her door, carrying the last message her son ever left behind. Before she could even face the truth, powerful men in town tried to force her out of the only home her son would know how to return to. They thought an old woman living alone would be easy to break. They didn't expect a battle-hardened Navy SEAL or the silent warning of a loyal German shepherd standing beside him. What happened next didn't just save a house by the lake. It changed the heart of an entire town. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more stories like this. Bluewater Point had the quiet patience of places that had learned to grow old slowly. The town rested along the northern edge of a wide lake whose water reflected the sky so clearly that on calm days the horizon seemed to vanish. Pine forests surrounded the village in thick green walls, and a single road curved along the shoreline like a ribbon laid gently on the earth. Most of the buildings were wood: aged cabins, a small diner with faded paint, a hardware store that smelled of oil and sawdust, and a handful of docks where fishing boats rocked lazily against the water. Generations of families had lived here. People remembered each other's grandparents. The post office clerk knew which mailbox belonged to which childhood story. In a town like that, silence carried memories, and at the far end of the lakeside road stood a small house that had become part of those memories. Evelyn Mercer had lived there for 47 years. She was 76 now, a slender woman whose back had begun to bend slightly with age but whose eyes still held the stubborn clarity of someone who had spent her life enduring northern winters. Her hair was white and thin, usually gathered in a loose bun at the back of her head. Her skin had the pale, delicate texture of old parchment, lined with decades of wind and sunlight from the lake. Despite her age, Evelyn moved carefully but steadily, like someone who refused to surrender to weakness simply because time insisted. Her home sat close to the water, a weathered wooden house with a narrow porch and a small dock stretching into the lake. The paint had faded long ago, and the roof sagged slightly under the weight of many winters. But the windows were always clean and the porch light always worked. Evelyn believed that mattered, because one day her son would need to see it. Nathan Mercer had been gone for 4 years. The United States Navy had delivered the news on a gray morning in late autumn. 2 officers had driven into Bluewater Point in a government vehicle and stepped onto Evelyn's porch with careful expressions and stiff posture. They explained the situation with the calm precision of men trained for such moments. Her son, Petty Officer Nathan Mercer, had gone missing during a classified mission in the Middle East. The official term was MIA, missing in action. They could not confirm death. They could not confirm survival. They could only confirm absence. No funeral followed. No folded flag rested in Evelyn's hands. No grave existed where she could kneel. Only uncertainty remained. And uncertainty, Evelyn had discovered, was a strange kind of hope. Because as long as no one could say Nathan was dead, she could still believe he might come home. Every evening she lit the porch lamp at dusk. Every morning she looked out across the lake. And every day she waited. Across the lake, however, the town itself had begun to change. Bluewater Point had once been a quiet fishing community, but money had found its way north in recent years. Wealthy visitors discovered the beauty of the lake, and land that had once been nearly worthless became suddenly desirable. At the center of that transformation stood Harlon Voss. Harlon was 58 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the deliberate posture of a man who had spent a lifetime convincing people he belonged at the top of any room he entered. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he kept a short, carefully trimmed beard that framed his sharp mouth. He dressed well, dark wool coats, polished shoes, expensive watches. But the true mark of his power was the quiet confidence with which he spoke to people. Harlon believed deeply in progress. In his mind, Bluewater Point was not a town with history. It was a development opportunity. Over the past decade, he had purchased most of the land around the lake. Cabins, docks, stretches of shoreline that once belonged to families who had lived there for generations. One by one, they had sold. Some sold for money. Some sold under pressure. Some sold simply because fighting a wealthy developer required energy they no longer possessed. Now, a large portion of the lake belonged to Harlon Voss. His vision was clear: a luxury resort, private docks, vacation homes for wealthy visitors from the cities. There was only one piece of land that refused to cooperate: Evelyn Mercer's house. Harlon had approached her politely at first, then persistently, then legally. He offered money, more than the property was worth. Enough for Evelyn to live comfortably in a retirement community in the nearest city. She declined. Then came letters from lawyers about zoning concerns. Evelyn declined. Then inspections. Then warnings about property lines. Evelyn declined. For Harlon, the house had become more than land. It had become an obstacle. On a warm afternoon in early summer, a dusty pickup truck rolled into Bluewater Point for the first time. The driver was Gideon Cross. At 39, Gideon carried the quiet presence of someone who had spent most of his adult life in dangerous places. He stood about 6 feet tall with a lean, efficient build shaped by years of military training rather than vanity. He had no beard. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a square jaw and pronounced cheekbones that gave his features a sharp, disciplined structure. His dark brown hair was cut in a military style, short, though slightly longer than strict SEAL regulation, and it curled faintly where the wind touched it. His skin was light but weathered, the kind that turned rough after years of cold air and sun. His eyes were gray-blue. They were steady eyes, watchful. Eyes that had seen more than he usually spoke about. Gideon wore an old tactical combat shirt, olive green and softened by years of washing, the cuffs and shoulders faintly frayed. His combat pants were worn earth brown with faded knees and cargo pockets that sagged slightly from constant use. On his feet were old military work boots, scuffed but solid. A battered military watch rested on his wrist. Beside him in the passenger seat sat a German shepherd, Valko. The dog was about 5 years old, large but lean, built for endurance rather than show. His coat carried the classic German shepherd pattern, a black saddle across his back with warm golden-brown fur along his sides and chest. His ears stood tall and alert. His eyes were amber, intelligent, and calm. Valko wore only a dark brown leather collar with a metal tag engraved with his name. He rarely barked without reason. Instead, he watched. And when Valko watched something, Gideon had learned to pay attention. In the truck's center console rested a small metal box. Gideon glanced at it occasionally as he drove. Inside were the last personal items belonging to a man he had once trusted with his life: Nathan Mercer. Bluewater Point appeared gradually as the road curved around the lake. The diner came first. Mara Flint's Lakeside Cafe, its sign slightly crooked but welcoming. Then the gas station. Then the small sheriff's office with a wooden bench out front. Gideon slowed his truck. Valko lifted his head. The dog's ears turned slightly, catching sounds that humans might miss. Distant voices, wind across water, the soft creaking of dock boards. Then something changed. Without warning, Valko stood abruptly in the passenger seat. The German shepherd stared out the windshield with sudden intensity. Gideon followed the dog's gaze. Across the road, half hidden behind a stand of pine trees, stood a small wooden house near the lake. Valko's ears sharpened. His body stiffened. The dog didn't growl, but the silence around him carried a kind of tension Gideon had seen before. On patrol, moments before danger revealed itself. "What is it?" Gideon murmured quietly. Valko didn't look away. For several long seconds, the dog simply stared at the house. Then his tail flicked once. Not in excitement, in recognition. As Gideon studied the lakeside house, something else caught his attention. Two men stood near the front gate. One of them was tall and heavy-set, with a thick neck and dark hair cut short along the sides. His leather jacket hung open over a gray shirt, and his posture carried the loose arrogance of someone used to intimidating people. This was Reed Talbot. Reed was 41 years old and had worked for Harlon Voss for nearly a decade. He handled land negotiations, inspections, and, when necessary, situations that required a heavier touch than lawyers could provide. Reed wasn't the kind of man who smiled often, and when he did, it rarely meant kindness. Standing in front of him on the porch was Evelyn Mercer. Even from the road, Gideon could see how small she looked compared to the men near her gate. But she wasn't stepping back. Reed held a folder of documents and spoke with exaggerated patience, gesturing toward the road and then toward the house. The second man leaned against the fence, watching with bored indifference. Evelyn crossed her arms. The wind from the lake moved her white hair slightly, but her posture remained firm. Then Reed reached forward suddenly, grabbing the edge of the gate as if to push it open. Valko's chest rumbled. A low growl rolled through the truck cabin like distant thunder. Gideon exhaled slowly. He had driven hundreds of miles to deliver a box. He had intended to leave Bluewater Point the same day. That had been the plan, but plans rarely survived the moment they met reality. Across the road, Evelyn Mercer remained standing between her house and the men who wanted it. Valko watched them with unwavering focus. The growl deepened slightly. Gideon's hand rested on the steering wheel. For a moment, he considered simply driving past. After all, this wasn't his town, not his fight. But then he glanced at the metal box in the console again. Nathan Mercer's name was still etched into the dog tag inside. And Gideon remembered the last words his friend had spoken before the mission went wrong. "If anything happens to me, make sure my mom isn't alone." Gideon shifted the truck into park. Outside, Reed Talbot raised his voice. The wind carried a fragment of the conversation across the road. "Just a legal access inspection, Mrs. Mercer." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "No." Reed's smile tightened. Valko's growl grew louder. Gideon opened the truck door. The quiet town of Bluewater Point suddenly felt less peaceful than it had 5 minutes earlier. And something told him this visit was not going to be as simple as delivering a box. Morning arrived gently over Bluewater Point. Mist drifted across the surface of the lake like pale smoke rising from quiet water. The early sun pushed through the tall pines surrounding the shore, casting long golden lines across Evelyn Mercer's porch. Somewhere in the distance, a loon cried across the water, its haunting call echoing between the hills. Inside the small lakeside house, the air carried the faint scent of old wood, dried lavender, and coffee that had been reheated too many times. Gideon Cross stood in the doorway with Valco beside him. For a brief moment, neither man nor dog moved. Evelyn Mercer had opened the door slowly when she heard the knock. Up close, she looked even smaller than Gideon remembered from the road the day before. Her shoulders were narrow beneath a cream-colored cardigan that had clearly been mended several times over the years. Her thin white hair was tied loosely behind her head. Those strands had slipped free during the night. But it was her eyes that held Gideon's attention. They were pale blue and searching, the eyes of someone who had learned to study every face carefully, hoping one day one of them might bring news she had been waiting years to hear. "You said yesterday," Evelyn began carefully, "that you knew my son." Her voice carried a quiet tremor that she tried to hide. Gideon nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Valco sat beside him on the porch boards, his amber eyes studying Evelyn with the same calm focus he used when watching unfamiliar terrain. His ears flicked slightly in the cool morning air. Evelyn stepped aside. "Please," she said softly, "come inside." The house felt like a place where time had folded inward. Every surface carried memories. A framed photograph on the wall showed a teenage boy in a baseball uniform, smiling with the reckless confidence of youth. Another picture showed a tall young man in navy dress blues, standing beside Evelyn on the same porch. Nathan Mercer. The furniture was simple, but carefully maintained. A small wooden table stood near the window overlooking the lake, and the curtains moved gently whenever a breeze slipped through the frame. Gideon noticed something else. Nothing had been moved in years. It was as if the house had been holding its breath. Evelyn led him into the kitchen and gestured toward a chair. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, an elderly woman's careful rhythm. But there was still strength in the way she carried herself. Her hands trembled slightly when she poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "You said your name was Gideon," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Gideon Cross." She set the mug in front of him. Then she noticed the metal box in his hands. Her breathing changed. For a moment she simply stared at it. "That belonged to Nathan," she whispered. Gideon placed the small metal container on the table between them. The box was scuffed and dull, the edges worn from years of travel in military gear. It was the kind of thing soldiers carried without thinking. Small, practical, meant to hold personal items that mattered more than regulations allowed. Evelyn reached for the box but stopped halfway. Her hand hovered above it. "Before you open it," Gideon said quietly, "I need you to understand something." Her eyes lifted to his. "What happened to my son?" The question was direct. It deserved the same honesty. Gideon leaned back slightly in the chair. "Nathan was part of my team," he said. "Special Operations Unit. We were deployed together 3 years ago." He paused. The memory moved through his mind like a cold wind across dark water. "It was a night mission," he continued. "Fast entry. Something went wrong." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "The last time I saw Nathan," Gideon said carefully, "he was covering our exit." Her eyes closed briefly. "He told me to get the others out." Silence settled over the room. "Nathan was still alive when we left the building," Gideon said. "But the structure collapsed during the airstrike that followed." Evelyn opened her eyes again. "They told me missing," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze returned slowly to the metal box. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside were only a few items: a military dog tag, a worn silver coin, a folded scrap of map paper, and an envelope sealed but never mailed. Evelyn lifted the dog tag first. Her fingers traced the engraved letters. Nathan Mercer. The room seemed to grow smaller around her. For several seconds, she didn't cry. She simply stared. Then the tears came. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet collapse of grief that had been held in place for years. Valko rose from the floor and walked slowly toward her. The German shepherd lowered his head and gently rested his muzzle against her knee. The gesture was careful, instinctive. Evelyn looked down at the dog. "Oh," she whispered softly. "You're a beautiful boy." Her hand moved automatically to stroke his head. Valko remained still, patient, as if he understood something deeper than the moment. As Evelyn held the dog tag, Valko suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood tall. His gaze shifted toward the back hallway of the house. Gideon noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he murmured. Valko stepped away from the table and walked slowly down the hallway. Evelyn blinked through her tears. "That's Nathan's room," she said quietly. The dog stopped in the doorway. For a long moment he simply stood there, looking into the room. Then Valko lowered his head slightly and let out a soft, almost questioning whine. Not fear, not warning. Recognition. Evelyn's breath caught. "That's strange," she whispered. Gideon watched the dog carefully. Valko had never met Nathan Mercer, but something in the room had caught his attention. Something neither of them could yet explain. After a few seconds, the dog returned calmly to Gideon's side, the moment passing like a ripple across still water. Yet the quiet feeling lingered in the room. Evelyn wiped her eyes gently with the corner of her sleeve. "He loved dogs," she said suddenly. Gideon looked up. "Nathan did?" She nodded. "When he was 12, he tried to train a stray shepherd mix that wandered into town." A faint smile appeared. The dog never listened to him, but Nathan insisted they were partners. She looked down at Valko again. "He would have liked you." Valko's tail tapped once against the floor. Gideon almost smiled. A vehicle engine sounded outside. Evelyn stiffened slightly. Through the window, a black SUV rolled slowly into the gravel drive. Gideon recognized it immediately. Harlon Voss stepped out first. Even in daylight, his presence felt imposing. He wore a charcoal coat over a white shirt despite the mild weather, and his polished shoes crunched softly against the gravel. In one hand, he carried a wicker basket filled with fruit. Behind him walked Reed Talbot. Reed looked exactly as Gideon remembered from the day before. Broad shoulders, heavy boots, dark stubble across his jaw. His expression suggested he expected trouble wherever he went. Evelyn sighed quietly. "He comes by often," she said. "Why?" Gideon asked. "To remind me how reasonable he's trying to be." Harlon knocked once before opening the door. "Mrs. Mercer," he said warmly. His voice carried smooth confidence. Then his eyes shifted to Gideon. For a moment his smile paused. "Well," Harlon said, "you must be the visitor I heard about." Gideon stood. "Gideon Cross." Harlon nodded politely. "Harlon Voss." He placed the fruit basket on the counter. "I thought Mrs. Mercer might enjoy some fresh produce from the South Orchard." Evelyn didn't touch the basket. Harlan's attention moved briefly to Valco. "That's quite a dog," he remarked. "German Shepherd," Gideon replied. "Working animal?" "Something like that." Harlan folded his hands calmly. "I won't stay long," he said. "I only came to check on a few matters regarding the shoreline access." Evelyn's shoulders straightened. "I told you yesterday," she said. "The answer hasn't changed." Harlan sighed as if disappointed. "Mrs. Mercer, the inspection is required. The dock may violate the updated shoreline regulations." "And the road?" she asked sharply. "That too," Harlan said lightly. "There may be a question of easement." Reed shifted slightly behind him. Valco's ears tilted forward. Gideon watched them both. The conversation was polite on the surface, but beneath it ran a quiet tension. Harlan turned his attention back to Gideon. "You're a long way from wherever you came from," he said. "Just passing through," Gideon replied. Harlan smiled faintly. Bluewater Point has a way of changing plans. His eyes moved briefly toward the metal box still open on the table. Recognition flickered. "Ah," he said softly. "Nathan Mercer." Evelyn's hand closed protectively over the dog tag. Harlan studied the moment. Then he stepped back toward the door. "Well," he said, adjusting his coat, "I won't interrupt your visit." He paused before leaving, but when he looked at Gideon again, the warmth in his expression had vanished. Instead, there was calculation. "You'll find," Harlan said quietly, "is that things here tend to settle themselves." Then he walked outside. Reed followed. The SUV door closed. The engine started. Through the window, Gideon watched the vehicle disappear down the road. Behind him, Evelyn sat silently at the table. Valco rested beside her chair. The quiet house felt heavier now. Gideon looked down at the dog tag still in Evelyn's hand. He had come to deliver a box, but something told him the story unfolding in Bluewater Point was far from finished. Gideon Cross had meant to stay in Bluewater Point one night, maybe two. By the third morning, he had stopped pretending that was still true. The town woke slowly under a pale northern sky. Sunlight filtered through the pines in long, cool bands, and the lake breathed light back into the world with a calm that seemed almost holy. From a distance, Bluewater Point looked untouched by hurry. Small fishing boats drifted near the docks. Smoke rose from chimneys. The post office opened its single front window. A pickup rattled past with lumber tied badly in the back. But the longer Gideon stayed, the more he felt the pressure hidden beneath that beauty. It was in the way conversations softened when certain names came up, in the way some people looked toward the road before speaking, in the way Evelyn Mercer, even in daylight, seemed to listen for trouble before she listened for peace. So Gideon rented a cabin. It sat at the edge of the woods, about half a mile from Evelyn's house, where the road narrowed and the trees pressed close enough to turn the air cooler. The place belonged to a widower named Amos Pike, a stooped man in his 70s with a face like dry cedar bark and hands permanently rough from decades of repairing boats. Amos asked almost no questions, which made Gideon trust him more. The cabin itself was simple. One bedroom, a small stove, a porch facing the trees, and windows cloudy with age. It smelled of pine boards, iron, and old winters. It suited him. He had lived in places far harsher than this, and called them temporary home. Valco approved of it immediately. The German Shepherd moved through the cabin with measured confidence, checking corners, pausing at each window, then stepping out onto the porch to test the wind. He was 4 or 5 years old, broad through the chest but lean through the waist, his black and tan coat thick enough for northern weather. His movements had the controlled economy of a trained working dog. Nothing about him was wasted. Not attention, not effort, not instinct. When he finished his quiet inspection, he sat at the top of the porch steps and watched the tree line as if he had already accepted that they would be staying. Gideon stood behind him with a mug of bad coffee and looked through the trees toward the faint glimmer of lake water. He told himself he was staying for practical reasons. Evelyn was vulnerable. Harlon Voss had made that plain. There had been a promise, too. Not a formal one. Nothing spoken over ceremony or oath. Just Nathan Mercer's voice in the dark of a ruined corridor years ago, telling Gideon to go, to move, to get the others out, and then half shouted over gunfire, half carried on breath. Don't let her be alone. Memory had a cruel way of preserving exactly the sentences a man could never escape. By mid-morning, Gideon headed into town. Valco rode in the passenger seat with his head near the open window, ears turning to every sound, chains clinking at the docks, gulls overhead, the rattle of tools outside the hardware store. Bluewater Point looked brighter in sunlight than it had on Gideon's first arrival, but brightness did not erase tension. It only made it easier to notice where the shadows fell. He parked near the lakefront diner. The sign above the door read Flint's Landing, painted in faded navy blue with white trim. Inside, the place smelled of coffee, fried potatoes, butter, and cedar smoke from a small iron stove in the corner. A chalkboard menu leaned slightly crooked behind the counter. Photographs of old fishing tournaments and winter festivals covered one wall. Behind the counter stood Mara Flint. She looked about 32, tall for a woman from a small lake town, with a quick, practical strength in the way she moved. Her hair was dark blonde, with copper in it where sunlight caught it, usually pulled into a loose knot that never stayed neat for long. A spray of freckles crossed the bridge of her nose, and her skin carried the fair tone common this far north. Easily burned in summer, easily chilled in spring. She wore a red flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, dark jeans, and a brown apron dusted faintly with flour. Mara had the face of someone who had smiled often in life and stopped trusting easily, not because she was hard, because she had learned. She glanced at Gideon once, then at Valco, then back to Gideon. "You're the man staying up at Amos Pike's cabin," she said. Gideon took a stool at the counter. "That obvious? In this town?" She set a mug down in front of him. "A new truck is obvious. A new man is news. A new man with a dog like that is practically weather." Valco sat beside Gideon's stool, calm and upright. Mara leaned slightly over the counter to look at him more closely. "He bites? Only when he runs out of patience." That earned the smallest curve of a smile. "I like him already," she said. She poured coffee without asking if Gideon wanted any. There was something efficient about her kindness, as though hospitality had become second nature long before ease ever did. "People said you were at Evelyn Mercer's place yesterday," Mara said. Gideon took a sip. "People say a lot." "They do." She wiped the counter with a folded cloth. "Most of them don't say it where Harlon can hear." The name settled between them. Mara's expression changed. Not frightened exactly, but sharpened. "He's bought almost everything worth buying around this lake," she said. "Cabins, shoreline lots, 2 marinas, the old cannery property, even the bait shop no one wanted. Some folks sold because the money was too good. Some sold because he made it too hard not to." "And Evelyn?" Mara gave a short, dry laugh. Evelyn Mercer would probably refuse to sell the gates of heaven if St. Peter offered enough cash. There was admiration in the remark, and worry. She's the last one on that stretch of shore, Mara continued. The last house he can't connect into his resort line. Without her property, his whole waterfront plan has a gap right in the middle. Gideon glanced toward the window, where sunlight flashed off the lake. He seems patient, he said. Mara folded the cloth and set it aside. That's because men like Harlon don't think of patience as waiting. They think of it as pressure applied slowly. By noon, Gideon walked 2 blocks to the sheriff's office. The building was small, more town station than real department, with a flag out front and chipped paint near the doorframe. Inside, a single desk faced a bulletin board covered with lost dog notices, boating permits, and reminders about brush cleanup before summer dry season. Sheriff Owen Bell emerged from the back room carrying a folder. He was in his late 40s, broad through the chest, with the thickened build of a man who had once been faster and never fully stopped being strong. His hair was light brown, gone silver at the sides, cut short beneath the brim of a tan sheriff's hat resting on the desk. He was clean-shaven, with deep-set eyes, and the kind of tired, steady face common in men who had spent years standing between other people's trouble and their excuses. Owen's handshake was firm, but his caution showed immediately. "You're cross," he said. "Gideon." The sheriff nodded. "I hear you've taken an interest in Mrs. Mercer's property." Gideon leaned one shoulder against the desk. "I've taken an interest in people leaning on an old woman." Owen exhaled through his nose. "That road easement dispute is technically a civil matter," he said. "And Harlan's lawyers know exactly how to dress civil pressure up so it smells legal." "You sound like you've had practice." Owen met his gaze, then looked away first. "Harlan's project keeps half this town working," he said. "Construction crews, suppliers, dock hands, maintenance, all of it. Town council likes his tax money. The state likes development. When you're sheriff in a place this size, you learn the difference between what's wrong and what you can prove." It wasn't cowardice Gideon heard. It was fatigue, and perhaps the slow shame of compromise. Before Gideon could answer, Valco, who had been lying quietly near the door, lifted his head. The dog's ears rose sharply. He stood and stared toward the side window. Owen noticed. "What's he hearing?" Gideon didn't reply at once. He had learned not to guess for Valco. Outside, beyond the glass, the wind moved through the pines. Then Valco let out one abrupt bark and turned toward Gideon. Not alarm. Instruction. Gideon followed the dog outside. Valco trotted across the side yard of the sheriff's office, nose low, then lifted it and angled toward the alley running behind the building. There, half hidden behind a stack of municipal gravel bags, lay a narrow piece of weathered wood splintered from a fence rail. Fresh tool marks scored the edge. Gideon crouched. The cut was clean, recent, deliberate. Not rot, not storm damage. Someone had sliced through old pine sometime within the last 12 hours. Sheriff Owen stepped up behind him and frowned. Where'd he find that? Gideon looked toward the road leading lakeward, the direction of Evelyn's house. For one strange second, the noon air seemed to cool around him. Not because the clue was dramatic, because it confirmed what instinct had already been whispering. Pressure in Bluewater Point was no longer staying on paper. Valco stood beside the broken rail, still and intent, his amber eyes fixed down the road, as though the dog could feel the shape of trouble long before human beings were willing to name it. Gideon didn't waste time. He drove straight to Evelyn's place. The house stood quiet under the afternoon sun, but the stillness felt wrong, too careful. He stepped out of the truck before it had fully settled, and Valko was beside him at once, moving toward the back of the property with the brisk purpose of a dog following a scent trail he already trusted. Behind the house, near the tree line, the problem became clear. Part of the rear fence had been cut. Not kicked in, not weathered loose. Cut cleanly through in two places, then bent inward to make an opening wide enough for a person to slip through without using the front road. Evelyn came out the back door while Gideon was inspecting the damage. She wore her old cardigan despite the mild day and held one hand against the frame as if steadying herself. Her face looked drained. "I saw it this morning," she said. "I was going to call someone." "You should have." Her chin lifted slightly at that. "I have been taking care of myself since before you were old enough to shave." The line almost made him smile. Almost. "Did anyone come inside?" he asked. "No." She hesitated. "At least, I don't think so." Valko moved past the cut fence, circling once, then returned to the back porch. He did not signal active pursuit. Whoever had come had not lingered long. Gideon straightened. "I'm fixing this. You don't have to." "Yes," he said more gently. "I do." He drove back into town for supplies. At the hardware store he bought posts, nails, wire, and a new hinge for the side gate, though the old one wasn't broken. The store owner, a thick-bellied man with kind eyes named Arthur Bennett, asked no questions beyond practical ones. Arthur looked to be around 50, with a pepper-gray beard trimmed close to his jaw and forearms lined by years of carrying lumber. Men like that existed in nearly every northern town. Solid, observant, not eager to involve themselves too early, but not blind either. When Gideon loaded the truck, Arthur came out carrying an extra coil of fencing wire. "You didn't buy enough," he said. Gideon reached for his wallet. Arthur shook his head once. "Just pay me next time. Or don't." That, in Bluewater Point, was its own kind of declaration. By late afternoon, Gideon was in Evelyn's yard with his sleeves rolled up, setting new posts. The work steadied him. Dig, brace, hammer, align. Valko patrolled the perimeter in slow circles, sometimes pausing at the road, sometimes returning to sit near Evelyn, who watched from the porch with a blanket over her knees. Once or twice, Gideon caught her studying him with a strange, searching expression, not quite maternal, not quite distant. The look a person gives when grief begins comparing one man to another without permission. As the light turned warmer, Mara arrived carrying a paper bag of sandwiches and a jar of lemonade. "I figured stubborn men doing fence work would forget to eat," she said. Evelyn made a soft sound that might once have been laughter. They sat for a few minutes on the porch, while Gideon drank water and Valko lay across the boards, head on his paws, but eyes open. Mara told small-town stories, as if feeding normalcy back into the place one sentence at a time. Who had sunk a fishing boat by tying it badly, whose grandson had tried to water ski before the thaw was fully gone, which councilman lied every election and still got invited to church suppers. But beneath her humor lived anger. "Harlon keeps saying he's bringing the future," she said at last, looking out toward the lake. "Funny how the future always seems to need old people moved out of the way." Evelyn's hand tightened around her lemonade glass. "I'm not leaving," she said. Mara turned to her. "I know." Gideon looked at the patched fence, the dock beyond it, the lake shining under the lowering sun. He had been in countries where danger came loudly: rifle crack, rotor wash, burning steel. This was different. Danger here wore paperwork, paved roads, measured smiles, and men who knew how to make cruelty sound efficient. He found, to his own surprise, that he hated it more. By evening, the fence stood straight again. The yard looked less exposed. Not safe, exactly, but defended. When Mara left and the first coolness of dusk moved in from the water, Evelyn remained on the porch while Gideon packed his tools. "You don't owe Nathan this much," she said quietly. He kept his eyes on the hammer in his hand. "Maybe not." She watched him for a long moment. "Then why are you still here?" That question had more weight than the simple words. Gideon finally looked up, because he did not yet know how to answer without saying too much. Because guilt was part of it. Because promise was part of it. Because Valko had looked at her house the way some people looked at churches. Because in a town that had learned to lower its voice around power, someone had to begin asking louder questions. He settled on the truth that fit the moment. "Because someone wants you afraid," he said. "And I'm not very good at helping with fear. But I'm good at standing where it's trying to go." Evelyn's eyes shone faintly in the porch light. For the first time since he had met her, she did not look only like a mother waiting. She looked like a woman remembering she might still have allies. Night gathered slowly over Bluewater Point. Gideon loaded the last of the tools into the truck. Valko jumped up into the passenger seat, then turned once, watching the house until Gideon climbed in. The porch lamp came on behind them with a soft, amber glow. As Gideon drove back toward the cabin, he saw the light reflected through the trees in brief flashes. A house. A signal. A refusal. And somewhere beyond the quiet shore, he could feel the shape of Harlon Voss's reach pressing against the town like a shadow too large to ignore. Bluewater Point still looked peaceful under the first stars. But peace, Gideon knew, was often just the surface of whatever had not broken open yet. The next morning came bright and cold, the kind of northern summer morning that looked gentle from a distance and still made the air bite when a person stepped into it. Sunlight spilled across the lake in long silver bands, and the pines along the shoreline stood motionless, dark and tall, like sentries that had learned not to interfere with human mistakes. Gideon Cross had slept badly. He had gone back to Amos Pike's cabin after repairing Evelyn Mercer's fence, but rest had come in fragments. Every time he drifted close to sleep, memory returned in broken pieces. Nathan's voice over comms, the crack of collapsing concrete, the last command shouted into smoke and dust. By dawn, Gideon had given up pretending that sleep would help him think more clearly. Valko had been awake before him. The German shepherd stood at the porch steps with his nose lifted toward the lake, his black and tan coat catching the pale light. He was still, but not relaxed. His ears twitched once, then again, receiving signals from a world humans only half understood. Gideon had seen that posture many times before. It meant the dog sensed a pattern before the man could name it. So instead of going straight into town, Gideon drove north along the shore. Bluewater Point changed subtly as the road curved away from the center of town. The houses grew older, farther apart, more weathered. The docks leaned lower into the water. The fences looked as if they had been repaired by the same hands for 30 years. Money had reached this part of the shoreline too, but not completely. The old life still held on here, though it did so with the caution of something hunted. The church stood on a rise above the lake, white paint peeling along its outer boards. its bell tower leaning just enough to suggest long endurance rather than collapse. A wooden sign out front read, Boone Chapel. Gideon parked beneath a stand of spruce trees. Inside, the chapel smelled of candle wax, dust, and old hymnals. Sunlight entered through narrow stained glass windows and laid faded patches of color across the worn wooden pews. At the far end of the sanctuary stood Pastor Eli Boone. He was in his late 60s, tall in the way some old men remain tall even after years of stooping. His body had thinned with age, but there was still something dignified in the way he carried himself. He had a long face, deep-set brown eyes, and a fringe of silver hair that curled behind his ears. His hands were narrow and veined, the hands of a man who had buried more people than he had baptized in recent years. He wore a dark sweater over a clerical collar, not because the weather required it, but because some men never quite stopped dressing for duty. Pastor Boone turned when he heard Gideon's boots against the floor. "You're the soldier," he said. Gideon nodded once. "That obvious? In Bluewater Point?" The old man smiled faintly. "Everything is obvious. People just decide what they are willing to admit." Valco entered behind Gideon, nails clicking softly on the floorboards. The dog paused, sniffed the air once, then settled near the first pew without making a sound. Boone noticed him and looked back at Gideon. "Evelyn spoke of you," the pastor said. "And of the dog." "Did she?" "She said he looks at people as if he's waiting for them to tell the truth." That almost drew a smile from Gideon. The pastor motioned toward a side room where a kettle rested on a small iron stove. They sat at a table too small for comfort and drank weak coffee while morning light moved slowly across the walls. Gideon did not waste time. "I was told you know the history of the land around the lake," he said. Pastor Boone's expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, something older. Weariness, perhaps, mixed with guilt. "In a town this small," Boone said quietly, "history isn't really history. It just waits in different rooms." He folded his hands. "Before Harlon Voss owned half this shoreline, his father did business here. Ruthless business, though dressed in a smile. And before Nathan Mercer went off to war, his father, Daniel Mercer, owned a strip of land that reached farther along the western bank than what Evelyn has now." Gideon listened without interrupting. "There was a dispute," Boone continued, "years ago. Officially, it was about access rights and subdivision boundaries. Unofficially," he looked toward the chapel window, "unofficially, it was about pressure. Daniel Mercer never trusted the Voss family. Said they bought land the way some men buy silence. What happened? A transfer was filed. Boundaries changed. Some people signed papers they did not fully understand. Others swore those papers looked different later than they had the day they were first shown." Gideon leaned back slightly. "So records were altered." Boone did not answer at once. Instead, he lowered his eyes to his coffee. "I said nothing," he admitted. "That's what happened." The confession landed heavily. "Why?" Gideon asked. The old pastor's jaw tightened. "Because Daniel Mercer was proud and stubborn. Because Harlan's father had lawyers. Because the town was smaller then, poorer then, and men who challenged money rarely found neighbors willing to stand beside them. I told myself it was not my place." He looked up. "That is how cowardice often introduces itself, as modesty, as restraint, as a desire to keep peace." There was no self-pity in his voice, only plain judgment. Gideon respected him more for that. When they left the chapel, Pastor Boone touched Valco once on the side of the neck. The dog accepted the gesture, but kept his eyes on the road. "Talk to Lucas Hale," Boone said. "If anyone still remembers how the shoreline was marked before things changed, it's him." Lucas Hale's boatyard sat on the north side of the inlet, where the water narrowed before opening again into the larger lake. The place looked as though it had been assembled from leftover winters. Stacks of timber, coils of rope, sheds patched with mismatched boards, old hulls resting on braces like sleeping animals, too broken to move. Lucas Hale was working beneath the skeleton of a cedar skiff when Gideon arrived. He was 38, broad-shouldered and strong through the forearms, with the balanced build of a man who still worked every day with his hands. His hair was dark blonde, thick and sun-lightened at the edges, and he wore a close beard that made his face look rougher than it probably was. There was sawdust on his jeans and a pencil behind one ear. His skin had been browned by years on open water, and his blue eyes held the steady wariness of a man who trusted slowly but remembered everything. He slid out from under the boat, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked first at Gideon, then at Valco. "That dog yours, or did he just decide you were worth following?" Lucas asked. "He still hasn't made up his mind." Lucas snorted once. Smart animal. Unlike Pastor Boone, Lucas did not pretend not to know why Gideon had come. "You're asking about the Mercers," he said. Gideon nodded. Lucas leaned one hip against the workbench behind him. "I grew up with Nathan," he said. "We fished this lake as kids. Stole apples from Voss orchards, too. Nathan was the one who got caught. I was the one who ran faster." A faint smile crossed his face and disappeared. "Daniel Mercer and my father built half these docks together. Back then, the Mercer property line extended farther north. Everyone knew it. Then survey flags changed after one winter. Strange thing was, the trees didn't move. The shore didn't move. Only the paperwork moved. Did Daniel fight it?" "He tried." Lucas's expression darkened. "But his wife got sick around then. Money got tight. Harlon's father offered help with fees and then bled him with it. That's how those people work. They don't always break your door down. They make you tired enough to open it yourself." The words stayed with Gideon. Before he left, Lucas walked into the back shed and returned with an old rolled map wrapped in oilcloth. "It's not official," he said. "Just a copy my father made for dock permits years ago. But if somebody starts telling you the shoreline always looked the way it does now, this says otherwise." Gideon took it carefully. For the first time since coming to Bluewater Point, he felt history shift from rumor to structure. Not enough to prove anything. Enough to matter. By afternoon, he went to see Sheriff Owen Bell again. The sheriff's office felt warmer than before, the air thick with paper dust and stale coffee. Owen was at his desk with a ledger open in front of him, reading through old property complaints. Gideon laid Lucas's map on the desk. Owen studied it, and something in his face tightened. "You've been busy." "You've been quiet," Gideon replied. Owen sat back. For several seconds, he looked older than he had the day before. Finally, he said, "There were records missing before I took office. Easement filings, shoreline adjustments. Some boxes from the county archive were sent here for storage 15 years ago and never all made it onto the shelves. You think Harlon took them?" Owen rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I think powerful men rarely need to steal with their own hands." "That isn't an answer." "No," the sheriff said, looking up at him. "It's the closest thing I've got to one." Then, after a long pause, "There's an old storage lot near the north shore. Abandoned boathouse, former records overflow during renovation years back. We never officially cataloged everything moved there. His eyes met Gideon's. If somebody wanted forgotten papers, forgotten is where they'd keep them. It wasn't permission, but it was close enough. Dusk came late that far north, and by the time Gideon drove toward the north shore, the sky had only just begun to turn from blue to iron gray. He left the truck behind a line of alder trees and continued on foot. Valco moved ahead of him, silent as shadow over pine needles and damp earth. The abandoned boathouse stood near the edge of a narrow cove where the water turned black under evening light. The roof sagged in the middle. One of the doors hung crooked. Reed grass whispered around the pilings. It was the kind of place people stopped seeing after they had driven past it enough times. Valco froze 20 yards from the entrance. His head lifted. Then he moved. Not fast, not reckless, but with sudden purpose. Gideon followed. Inside, the boathouse smelled of rot, lake mud, and stale gasoline. A beam of fading light cut through broken boards. In that dimness, a man bent over a wooden crate. Reed Talbot. He turned at the sound of Valco's growl. For one fraction of a second, all three of them held still. The dog tense and low, Gideon in the doorway, Reed crouched beside the crate with his hand still on a stack of papers tied in twine. Then Reed moved first. He shoved the crate back into shadow and lunged for the side exit. Gideon crossed the distance quickly, but the floorboards shifted under his boots and cost him half a second. Reed slammed a shoulder into him hard enough to jar bone, then burst through the side opening and ran toward the tree line. Valco gave chase for 10 yards before Gideon called him back. "No!" The dog stopped instantly, chest heaving once, eyes locked on the dark woods where Reed had disappeared. Gideon stepped back to the crate. Inside were old files, bound ledgers, rolled plats, and county copies gone soft at the edges from damp. Not enough time to search everything thoroughly. Not with the chance Reed might return with company, but enough to know what he was looking at. Records. Land records. Bluewater Point's forgotten bones. He took one bundle at random and opened it in the failing light. Transfer permits, survey notations, a partial ledger with names he recognized, Mercer among them. The evening air seemed to press inward around him. This was no longer just Evelyn Mercer's fight against a wealthy developer. This was a pattern, a system, a town slowly reshaped on paper until people doubted what they had once seen with their own eyes. Valco stood beside him, staring into the darkness where Reed had fled, then turned and looked back at Gideon. Not alerting now, confirming. Gideon closed the ledger and lifted the first stack of files from the crate. For the first time since arriving in Bluewater Point, he understood with complete clarity that what had happened here did not belong to one widow, one missing son, or one greedy man. It belonged to the whole town. And if that was true, then silence here had been purchased a long time ago. But silence, he thought, was beginning to crack. The morning broke hard and bright over Bluewater Point. As if the sky had chosen a cruel kind of beauty for the day, trouble finally stopped pretending to be polite. The lake shone like hammered glass beneath the sun. Gulls wheeled above the docks. Pine shadows stretched dark and cool across the road, but the air already carried the dry warmth of late morning. From a distance, Evelyn Mercer's house looked almost peaceful again. The repaired fence stood straight along the back line. The porch lamp had gone dark with dawn. The small dock reached into the water like an old hand still refusing to unclench. Gideon Cross was not there when the trouble arrived. He had driven into town just after sunrise to make copies of several pages from the records he had taken from the abandoned boathouse. He wanted names, dates, parcel lines, something he could compare before he brought any more questions to Sheriff Owen Bell. He had told Evelyn he would be gone less than an hour. Valco had stayed. The German shepherd lay on the porch in a patch of morning light when Gideon left, his black and tan coat gleaming along the shoulders, his amber eyes half closed, but never truly asleep. He had chosen that position himself, angled so he could see both the road and the yard. Working dogs did not merely rest. They arranged themselves around possibilities. Inside the house, Evelyn moved slowly through the kitchen. She wore her cream cardigan over a faded blue dress, and though age had thinned her body and bent her slightly at the shoulders, there was still iron in the way she lifted a kettle or folded a towel. Her face looked more tired in recent days, the skin beneath her eyes hollowed by grief and poor sleep. Yet there was also something in her expression that had not been there before Gideon came to town. Not hope exactly, but resistance sharpened by witness. She had spent years alone in her waiting. That kind of loneliness hollowed a person differently than sorrow. Now someone had stepped into that silence. It had not removed her pain. It had simply kept it from swallowing the whole room. At 10:15, 2 trucks rolled into her gravel drive. The first was Reed Talbot's dark pickup. The second belonged to Marvin Sloat, a heavy-set man in his early 50s who worked contract jobs for anyone paying cash and asking few questions. Marvin had a broad, sunburned face, pale lashes nearly invisible against weathered skin, and a stomach that pushed against the buttons of his work shirt. He was not naturally cruel. He had simply spent too many years standing beside men who were. With him came a younger man named Kurt Blevins, maybe 28, narrow through the hips but thick in the shoulders, with reddish stubble on a jaw too young for the bitterness it carried. Kurt had the restless eyes of men who confuse aggression for adulthood. His father had drunk away 2 boats and a marriage, and Bluewater Point had long ago become the kind of place where boys like Kurt learned that serving power felt safer than challenging it. Reed stepped out first. He wore a gray field jacket over a dark shirt, work boots dusted with gravel, and the same hard expression he seemed to consider part of his job. His thick neck reddened easily in heat, and this morning a pulse beat visibly near his jaw. Gideon's appearance at the boathouse the night before had unsettled him. Men like Reed were comfortable when others stayed confused. They disliked witnesses. Valco stood before Reed even reached the porch. No barking, no wild charge, just one smooth rise from stillness into readiness. The dog positioned himself between the steps and the yard, head level, ears forward, muscles held in disciplined tension. Evelyn opened the front door before Reed could knock. "What do you want?" she asked. Reed lifted a folder. "County inspection notice," he said. "Structural review, shoreline compliance, and emergency relocation of movable property pending hazard determination." He said it fluently, like language that had been practiced in front of a mirror. Evelyn did not step aside. "You don't come into my house without permission." Reed smiled without warmth. "Mrs. Mercer, I'd prefer not to make this difficult." Marvin shifted his weight near the truck, looking everywhere but at Evelyn. Kurt glanced at Valco and made the mistake of smirking. The dog did not move. Evelyn held out her hand. "Let me see the paper." Reed passed it to her, but when she began reading, he stepped up onto the porch as if the argument were already decided. Valco's chest rumbled, A low, controlled warning. Evelyn lifted her eyes. "Get off my porch." Reed ignored her. "There are also questions regarding unsafe storage and obstruction of access," he said. "If the structure is deemed non-compliant, county procedure allows temporary clearing." "It allows theft dressed in a necktie," Evelyn snapped. The old woman's voice startled even Marvin. For a moment all of them saw not a widow waiting for a missing son, but the younger version of her that must once have stood beside Daniel Mercer and fought every winter this lake ever threw at them. Then Kurt climbed the first porch step. That changed everything. Gideon was halfway back from town when he saw the trucks from the road. His grip tightened on the wheel before thought caught up to instinct. Valco was already visible from a distance, a rigid, dark shape at the base of Evelyn's porch. Gideon pulled over so hard, gravel sprayed from beneath the tires. By the time he crossed the yard, the argument had broken open. Kurt had stepped onto the porch and reached toward the paper in Evelyn's hand. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way." She jerked the folder back. "Do not touch me." Reed moved in, faster now, patience falling away. "Give me that." He grabbed at the papers. Evelyn stumbled against the porch rail. Valco launched forward, not at Reed's throat, not blindly, but with perfect trained judgment. The dog cut across the space between them and planted himself squarely between Evelyn and the men, teeth bared, growl erupting from deep in his chest. The sound stopped everyone at once. Kurt swore and swung one arm out, not to strike the dog, but to shove past him. It was enough. Gideon hit the porch steps at speed. He caught Kurt's wrist in one hand, rotated the arm down and across, and used the man's own momentum to slam him chest first against the porch post. The movement was so fast it barely looked violent until Kurt cried out. Marvin backed away at once. Reed turned sharply. "Get your hands off him!" Gideon's face had gone cold in the way it did when training took over and emotion became precision. "You brought men to push an old woman off her own porch," he said. "You don't get to raise your voice now." Reed took one step forward. Valco shifted instantly, angling his body between Reed and Gideon, lips curled just enough to make the choice clear. Not bluffing. Never bluffing. Reed stopped. For one suspended second, the whole yard seemed to hold its breath. Then a car door slammed down the road. Mara Flint was hurrying across the grass from where she had parked near the shoulder, apron still on, hair half loose from the knot at the back of her head. Behind her came Arthur Bennett from the hardware store, thick arms pumping, and old Amos Pike with his cap in one hand and anger in his long stride. In a town this small, raised voices traveled faster than radio. People began gathering at the road. Not many at first. Enough. Enough for witnessing to become dangerous. In the middle of the shouting, while Reed argued and Kurt tried to wrench free and Mara yelled that she had already called the sheriff, Valco suddenly turned his head toward Evelyn. The German shepherd's whole expression changed. The fight dropped out of him in an instant. He moved to her side and pressed his shoulder hard against her legs. Evelyn's face had gone pale. Not frightened pale. Wrong pale. She was still standing, but the hand clutching the porch rail had begun to shake violently. The inspection notice slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the boards like a dead leaf. For one fleeting heartbeat, she looked past Gideon entirely, past the men, past the yard. Her eyes fixed on him with a stunned, broken tenderness that did not belong to this morning. "Nathan," she whispered. The name fell out of her like a prayer spoken by accident. Then her knees buckled. That moment split the whole scene open, Not into violence, but into truth. Everyone on that porch, even the men who had come to intimidate her, suddenly stood in the presence of something larger than property lines. Grief had been living in that house so long, it had finally begun speaking out loud. Gideon released Kurt immediately and caught Evelyn before she struck the floorboards. Her body felt terribly light in his arms. Too light. "Mara!" "I'm here," Mara said, already climbing the porch. She dropped to one knee beside them, all brisk competence now. Her freckles stood out sharply against skin gone white with alarm. "Evelyn? Can you hear me?" Evelyn's hand clutched weakly at Gideon's sleeve. Her breathing came short and shallow. Marvin looked sick. Kurt, his face red from pain and humiliation, muttered something under his breath and backed off the porch entirely. Reed said nothing for once. A siren sounded faintly from town. Sheriff Owen Bell arrived less than 4 minutes later, which in Bluewater Point meant he had driven harder than usual. He came out of the cruiser already moving, hat shoved back, jaw tight. One glance told him enough. The townspeople on the road. The men from Harlon's crew. Gideon crouched on the porch, holding Evelyn upright. The dog standing guard at his side. Owen's face closed like a door. "What happened?" "Ask him," Mara snapped, pointing at Reed. "Or ask the half of town that heard them from the road." Reed found his voice before anyone else could answer. "We had county authority to inspect," he said sharply. "This man assaulted one of my workers." Owen looked at Kurt, who was flexing his wrist with theatrical misery. Then he looked at Evelyn, barely conscious in Gideon's arms. "Your inspection can wait," Owen said. Reed's mouth flattened. "Harlon Voss will hear about this." "I imagine he will," the sheriff replied. The ambulance arrived moments later. 2 volunteer medics lifted Evelyn carefully onto a stretcher. She had not fully lost consciousness, but her pulse was fast and irregular, and the lines around her mouth had gone gray. As they loaded her into the back, her eyes found Gideon one more time. That same broken confusion returned. Nathan's name hovered on her lips, but did not fully emerge again. Gideon stood in the gravel watching the ambulance pull away, and for the first time since arriving in Bluewater Point, he felt something sharper than guilt. He felt claimed. Not by the town, not by the fight. By the weight of a promise that was no longer abstract. Harlon had chosen escalation, and the cost had landed in the body of a 76-year-old woman who had already carried more weighting than most lives should require. Reed stepped toward his truck. "This isn't over," he said. Gideon turned his head slowly. "No," he answered. "It isn't." There was no raised voice in it. That made it worse. By late afternoon, Bluewater Point had heard the whole story 3 different ways and believed the worst one. At the small clinic near the harbor, Gideon waited outside Evelyn's room while Mara sat beside him with paper cups of vending machine coffee neither of them wanted. Sheriff Owen came once, spoke quietly with the attending nurse, then with Gideon. "She had a mild cardiac episode," he said. "Stress-triggered, not a major attack, but she needs rest." Gideon looked through the narrow window in the door. Evelyn lay beneath a pale blanket, smaller than ever. "She asked for you," Owen said. Inside the room the light was dim, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old flowers. When Gideon stepped to the bedside, Evelyn opened her eyes. For a moment she looked confused, then very clear. She reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, but deliberate. "Nathan," she whispered again. The word struck him harder this time because it came without chaos around it. Just pain, just longing, just the unbearable habit of a mother's hope refusing to die when everything else in her life had tried to teach it how. Gideon bent his head. "It's Gideon," he said softly. A small tremor crossed her face. Whether from embarrassment, grief, or understanding, he could not tell. "I know," she whispered after a long moment, but she did not let go of his hand. And Gideon understood then, more clearly than before, that he had crossed some line inside himself he would not be stepping back over. He had not come to Bluewater Point only to deliver a box. He had come to finish something Nathan never had the chance to finish. And now, whether he wanted the burden or not, he was part of the life that burden had been left behind to protect. Outside the window, evening settled over the lake in strips of gold and blue. The town went on. The gulls cried, the pines darkened, and somewhere beyond the clinic walls, men like Harlon Voss were already deciding their next move. But inside that quiet room, with Evelyn's hand still wrapped around his, Gideon made a decision of his own. He was not leaving. By the second week of July, the woods around Bluewater Point had changed their voice. The pines still stood tall around the lake, their dark branches combing the sky, their trunks straight as cathedral pillars. The water still flashed blue and silver under the sun. Tourists still would have called it beautiful if any had been foolish enough to wander that far north before the resort roads were finished. But the beauty had grown brittle. The moss beneath the trees had dried to a rough brown mat. Pine needles crackled under boots instead of bending softly into earth. Even the wind seemed thinner now, carrying that faint, sharp smell of resin and old bark warming too fast beneath the sun. Gideon noticed it first in the mornings when he stepped out of Amos Pike's cabin with coffee in his hand and Valko at his side. The German shepherd would pause at the porch stairs, lift his head, and test the air. His black saddle gleamed dark against his gold-brown coat, and his ears would angle toward the ridgeline as if the woods themselves were trying to speak. At 4 or 5 years old, Valko was in the full prime of his strength, heavy through the chest, lean through the flanks, disciplined in every movement. He had learned long ago that danger often arrived with no more sound than a shift in wind. That week he kept watching the North Ridge. So did Gideon. Evelyn Mercer had been allowed home from the clinic 2 days earlier, but only under strict instructions to rest. She did not like being told to rest. She obeyed with the dignity of a woman humoring people younger than herself, which meant she remained seated more often, but still tried to make her own tea, and still insisted on folding towels that no one had asked her to fold. Her face looked thinner after the cardiac episode. The pale skin along her temples seemed almost translucent in certain light, and there was a new fragility in the way her fingers curled around cups or chair arms. Yet emotionally, she had changed in another direction altogether. She no longer looked merely tired. She looked alert, as though surviving the porch incident had stripped something away from her, some final illusion that the men pressing in on her house might one day stop if only she endured quietly enough. Now she watched them back. That morning, Gideon sat with her on the porch, while Mara Flint watered the flower boxes and scolded both of them for not eating enough. Mara had appointed herself unofficial quartermaster of the Mercer household. She arrived each day with food, practical advice, and the temper of a woman who had finally tired of swallowing her opinions for the convenience of richer men. In the bright sun, her freckles stood out across her nose, and the copper-gold strands escaping her knot of hair flashed when she turned her head. She had the sturdy ease of someone born to work, not pose, and every movement she made carried purpose. "You smell that?" she asked, pausing with the watering can in her hand. Gideon looked up. The wind shifted. Smoke. Only a trace of it. But enough. Valco stood immediately. Evelyn's gaze lifted toward the northern hills beyond the lake. "Brush fire?" "Could be a farmer burning slash," Mara said, though her voice held little conviction. Gideon already knew it wasn't that simple. By noon, the sheriff's truck had driven the road twice with notices to stay alert. By 1 o'clock, a volunteer engine rattled north with 2 men hanging off the side rail. By 2, a dark plume had risen beyond the tree line like a wound opening in the summer sky. Bluewater Point had seen fire before. That was what made everyone quiet. Not panic. Not yet. Experience. Sheriff Owen Bell came by the house in person just after 3. He looked older than he had a week ago, and dust clung to the legs of his uniform trousers. His broad face, lined from long years of public patience, had gone tight around the mouth. "It's still small," he said. "Started up on the north slope. State crews are on the way, but we're preparing a temporary evacuation notice for the western shoreline if the wind turns." Evelyn gripped the porch arm with one hand. "Do I need to leave?" "Not yet," Owen said. "But have a bag ready." She stared toward the lake, past him. "I won't leave the house open." Gideon answered before Owen could. "Then you won't leave it open." Owen met his eyes and understood the promise inside the words. The sheriff nodded once. "I'll circle back." After he left, Gideon packed quietly. Not like a civilian gathering possessions. Like a man preparing for movement under pressure. Water. Flashlight. First aid kit. Copies of the most important land records. Nathan's metal box. The rolled map from Lucas Hale. Evelyn's medication. Valco watched every motion. The dog had grown more protective around Evelyn since the porch incident. He followed her from room to room, never crowding her, only making sure she remained inside the map of his attention. When she sat, he lay nearby. When she stood, he rose first. Toward late afternoon, the sky changed color. The sunlight turned brass-toned. Shadows sharpened. Ash began drifting down in tiny gray flecks that looked almost harmless until they landed on sleeves and porch railings and proved themselves real. Mara came back with her pickup half-loaded and a new passenger beside her. It was Nora Bell, Sheriff Owen's sister, a woman in her early 40s with sun-browned skin, thick dark hair braided over one shoulder, and the powerful forearms of someone accustomed to lifting crates and splitting wood. She ran the general store in town and had spent years taking care of people without ever asking if they deserved the effort. Her husband had died in a logging accident 12 years earlier, and grief had carved something sober and durable into her. She was not sentimental. She was reliable, which in a place like Bluewater Point mattered more. "Store's shut," Nora said as she climbed out. "Council wants folks with medical needs closer to town. I brought extra blankets and water." Evelyn almost protested. Nora cut her off with a look so practical it bordered on affectionate tyranny. "You can tell me no after you're breathing smoke less than this," she said. Then Valco barked once. Not at the road, at the side yard. All 4 humans turned. The German shepherd stood rigid, head low, eyes fixed toward the back of the house near the kitchen window. His lips were not pulled back, but something had gone taut through his whole body. Gideon moved instantly. He rounded the side of the house just in time to catch sight of a man slipping through the open yard gate. Reed Talbot. He had come in low, thinking the smoke and confusion would cover him. His gray field jacket was gone. He wore only a dark shirt clinging damply to his back. Ash streaked one sleeve. His face looked rougher than usual, more desperate than hard. For a split second, Reed froze when he saw Gideon. Then he bolted. Gideon ran him down before he reached the road. Not elegantly, not in one clean move like on the porch. The gravel slid under both of them, and Reed fought with the ugly strength of a man cornered by consequences rather than conscience. They went down hard near the ditch. Valco arrived like a shadow at Gideon's shoulder, teeth bared inches from Reed's face. That ended the struggle. Reed lay breathing hard, cheek pressed into the dust, one arm pinned behind him. "What were you doing in that house?" Gideon said. Reed spat dirt and coughed. "Nothing." Gideon tightened his grip. Reed hissed with pain. The fire-scented wind moved over all of them, hot now, carrying a dull roar from far off in the trees. "You came back for something," Gideon said. "What?" Reed stared at the dog. It was not courage that broke in him. It was timing. The fire. The heat. The realization that even men who worked for Harlon Voss could burn the same as everyone else. "The letter," Reed muttered. Gideon leaned closer. "What letter?" "The one in the box, Nathan's letter." On the porch, Evelyn had stepped halfway to the yard before Nora caught her arm. Mara stood beside her, ash falling into her hair like gray snow. "Why?" Gideon asked. Reed swallowed, jaw flexing. "Because Harlon knows what's in it." Gideon felt the world narrow. Reed laughed once, bitterly, then winced. "You think this is just about an old lady's dock?" Daniel Mercer signed transfer papers years ago when his wife was dying. Harlan's father buried the real terms. There was a contingent reversion clause on part of the shoreline. If Daniel's direct heir contested the altered survey with supporting family declaration, the title chain could reopen. The words came ugly and rushed, half legal, half panicked memory. "Nathan knew?" Gideon asked. "Not everything. Enough. He had copies made before deployment. Harlon heard about it later. Figured the son disappeared, problem solved. Then you show up with his box." Reed shut his eyes briefly. "If that letter is a declaration or even mentions the old boundary dispute, Evelyn could challenge the transfer. Court would freeze the project. Investors would run." Mara had gone still on the porch. Evelyn looked as though the air itself had shifted under her feet. Gideon held Reed another moment, letting the confession settle where everyone could hear it. Then Sheriff Owen's truck pulled into the drive. He got out fast, took one look at Reed in the dust, another at the smoke thickening over the ridge, and understood enough. "Take him," Gideon said. Owen cuffed Reed without argument. "What did he say?" "Enough," Gideon answered. "More at the station." As Owen led Reed toward the cruiser, Valco suddenly turned away from all of them and trotted back into the house. Not frantic, certain. Gideon followed. The dog went straight to the kitchen table where Nathan's metal box sat beside Evelyn's packed evacuation bag. Valco nudged it once with his nose, then looked up at Gideon. Only then did Gideon notice what had shifted. The sealed envelope inside the box, Nathan's letter, had not been addressed to Evelyn. It had been addressed in Nathan's handwriting to whoever gets home first. For one strange, quiet heartbeat, the smoke outside, the shouting yard, the whole burning world seemed to recede. Gideon stared at the words, not because he understood them yet, because they felt like the voice of a dead man stepping 1 inch closer to the living. Then Valko rested his chin briefly against Gideon's wrist, as if reminding him that whatever the letter meant, it had survived long enough to matter. They evacuated before sunset, not because the fire had reached the house, but because the wind turned west, and everyone who had spent a lifetime near those woods recognized what that meant. Mara drove Evelyn and Nora into town. Gideon followed in his truck with Valko. Ash drifted over the lake in slow spirals, and red light pulsed faintly above the tree line like the sky had swallowed a furnace. The town hall became a temporary shelter. Pastor Eli Boone moved among cots and folding chairs with sleeves rolled high, handing out bottled water with the brisk humility of a man trying to repay old silence through usefulness. His narrow face looked strained in the harsh fluorescent light, but his voice remained steady. Lucas Hale arrived later with 2 volunteers from the boatyard, smelling of sweat, cedar dust, and smoke. They had been helping clear dry brush behind the North Marina in case embers jumped. His shirt clung to his shoulders, and soot darkened the line of his beard. In one corner, Sheriff Owen sat with a recorder, while Reed Talbot, pale and hollow-eyed now, repeated the essentials of what he had confessed. Pastor Boone and Lucas both signed statements regarding the older survey dispute and the long-known rumors of altered records. Owen called the county attorney from a landline that kept cutting in and out under fire weather strain. By midnight, the first legal order went through. Temporary injunction. Immediate review of all active development permits tied to the disputed Mercer parcels. Harlon Voss did not appear in person. He called, twice. Owen listened to the first call in silence, then answered the second with enough bluntness that half the room went still listening to him. "No, Harlon," he said. "This time it doesn't wait until Monday." The next morning the fire crews gained the ridge. State forestry planes dropped retardant along the north line. Volunteer teams held the lower edge. The blaze charred part of the slope, blackened a stand of old pine, and scorched 2 storage sheds near the old marina, but the wind broke before it could drive fully into Bluewater Point. When Gideon drove Evelyn back home, the world looked altered. The lake was still blue, the house still stood, but the ridgeline beyond it wore a scar of black ash and smoking earth. Evelyn stood in the yard for a long time before going inside. "I used to think the worst thing was waiting," she said quietly. Gideon said nothing. She looked toward the burned slope. "Turns out the worst thing is learning how fast everything can go." Valko moved to her side and sat there, close enough for his warmth to reach her leg. By afternoon, word had spread that Harlan's project was frozen pending investigation. Investors had been notified. County records were being reviewed. Bluewater Point, after years of lowering its voice, had begun to speak in complete sentences. But the fire had done something else too. It had stripped away the illusion that people could keep postponing courage until a more convenient season, because convenience, like dry pine and old paper, burned quickly. That evening, Gideon stood on Evelyn's porch while smoke faded into the upper sky. On the table behind him rested Nathan's unopened letter. In the yard below, ash still clung in the grass like winter arriving out of order. The house had survived. The truth had survived. For now, that had to be enough. The fire left a scar across the northern ridge, but Bluewater Point survived. In the weeks that followed, the smell of smoke slowly faded from the air. New grass began pushing through blackened earth along the slopes, stubborn green against the charcoal ground. The lake returned to its calm blue mirror, reflecting clouds as if nothing had ever threatened the quiet shore. But something in the town had changed. People spoke differently now, Not louder exactly, but clearer. The investigation into the land records moved faster than anyone expected. The county office reopened surveys that had not been questioned for nearly 20 years. Boxes of documents that had once sat untouched in storage rooms were suddenly important again. Old maps were compared against new ones. Names long buried in paperwork surfaced in conversations at the diner, the marina, and the church steps. Harlon Voss did not disappear overnight. Men like him rarely did. But his certainty vanished. By the end of the month, the county issued a temporary injunction freezing development along several miles of shoreline. Investors began withdrawing from the proposed resort project, unwilling to risk millions on land titles now tangled in legal review. Harlon still owned property. He simply no longer controlled the future of the lake. Bluewater Point noticed the difference immediately. For the first time in years, people stood longer on sidewalks talking to each other. At Mara Flint's diner, fishermen who once avoided the subject of the resort now spoke openly about what the lake used to be before survey lines and contracts changed it. Lucas Hale's boatyard filled with locals discussing dock repairs and shoreline boundaries as if they had rediscovered their right to care. And Evelyn Mercer's porch light remained on every evening. But the reason had begun to shift. Evelyn had grown stronger since leaving the clinic. Her steps were still slow, and her heart sometimes forced her to pause halfway up the porch stairs. But the fragile look that had followed her home from the hospital gradually faded. In its place came something quieter but more powerful, a sense of direction. For years, her life had been shaped by waiting. Waiting had been the rhythm of her mornings and nights. Waiting for a letter. Waiting for a call. Waiting for footsteps that never came down the road from the lake. But now waiting no longer felt like the only thing left. One late afternoon, about 3 weeks after the fire, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with Nathan's metal box in front of her. Sunlight entered through the window behind her and spread across the old wood surface like a warm hand. Dust motes drifted slowly through the beam. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock above the stove. Across the room, Valko lay on the floor near the doorway. The German shepherd had grown comfortable in the Mercer house. He moved through it with the calm authority of an animal that understood he had been accepted into the territory. His coat shone richly under the afternoon light, black along the spine, golden brown along the ribs, the thick fur of his neck rising slightly whenever he lifted his head to listen. He was watching Evelyn now, not anxiously, patiently. Gideon Cross stood at the sink rinsing 2 coffee mugs. He had been planning to leave the next morning. The truck was already half-packed, supplies sorted, maps folded. He had told himself the promise he made, to make sure Evelyn was not alone, had been fulfilled. The town stood behind her now. The legal fight was moving in the right direction. Sheriff Owen Bell had promised to keep watch on the property lines. Mara Flint had made it clear that half the town would show up if anyone tried stepping over that fence again. By every practical measure, Gideon had finished what he came to do. Still, something about leaving felt strangely unfinished. Evelyn broke the quiet. "I think it's time," she said. Her voice carried the fragile steadiness of someone about to open a door she had been avoiding for years. She reached into the metal box and lifted the sealed envelope. Nathan's handwriting stretched across the front. Her fingers lingered along the ink lines as if tracing the shape of his voice. Gideon did not move. The room felt suddenly smaller. Evelyn opened the envelope slowly. The paper inside had yellowed slightly along the folds, but the writing remained clear. She began reading. At first, she said nothing aloud, Her eyes moved line by line. A tear slid quietly down her cheek, but she did not stop. Then, after several minutes, she lifted her head. "He wrote this before his last deployment," she said softly. Her voice trembled, though the words themselves seemed calm. "He must have known the mission was dangerous." Gideon leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. "What does it say?" Evelyn looked back down at the letter. "He says, if he doesn't come home, he doesn't want me to spend the rest of my life waiting at the window." Her mouth curved slightly, the kind of smile grief makes when it finally stops fighting reality. "He says the lake has too much life in it for that." Evelyn paused in the middle of the page. Her eyes widened slightly. Valko lifted his head at the same moment, as if sensing the change in her breathing. "What is it?" Gideon asked. She read the next line again, slower. "Nathan writes," she swallowed. "He writes that if the house is still standing and the porch light still works, I should keep it on for people who might need it." Her voice grew quieter. "He says there are always soldiers passing through the north roads, men and women coming back from things they can't explain to anyone." The paper trembled faintly in her hands. "He writes that maybe the house could be a place where they stop, where they remember they made it home." The room went silent. For several seconds no one moved. Then Valko rose from the floor and walked slowly to Evelyn's chair. The dog rested his head gently against her arm. It was not training. It was instinct. And for the first time since the letter had been opened, Evelyn laughed softly through her tears. "That sounds like him," she whispered. Later that evening, the porch light flickered on again. But now the light felt different. Not a signal sent into darkness hoping one person would see it. Something wider. A welcome. Word spread through town quickly, the way it always had in Bluewater Point. Mara Flint was the first to arrive after hearing the idea. She leaned against the porch rail with her arms crossed and listened carefully as Evelyn explained Nathan's wish. When Evelyn finished, Mara nodded slowly. "You're thinking of turning this place into a rest stop for veterans." Evelyn smiled gently. "Not a business, not a shelter. A home," she said, "even if only for one night." Lucas Hale came by the next morning with a bundle of cedar boards under his arm. "Dock needs fixing anyway," he said. "Might as well make room for more boats." Sheriff Owen Bell stopped by that afternoon and leaned on the fence while listening to Evelyn describe her plan. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "the state highway up north runs a lot of long-distance truck routes. Soldiers hitch rides through there all the time." Evelyn nodded. "Then maybe they'll see the porch light." Pastor Eli Boone visited that Sunday after church. The old minister stood at the edge of the yard with his hands folded and looked at the house for a long time before speaking. "It seems," he said quietly, "that Daniel Mercer's home may finally become what he always believed it was." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "And what was that?" "A harbor." Gideon stayed longer than he planned. Not permanently. Not yet. But long enough to help repair the dock and reinforce the porch steps. Long enough to help Mara carry supplies from town and stack them neatly in the spare bedroom that Evelyn had decided would become the guest room. Valko took his new role seriously. The German shepherd now spent most evenings lying at the top of the porch steps, watching the road that curved along the lake. His ears twitched at distant engines. His amber eyes followed the shadows of passing headlights. Sometimes the road remained empty. Sometimes a car slowed. One evening, a pickup stopped briefly while the driver leaned out the window and asked if the place was open to travelers. Evelyn stepped forward with a lantern in her hand. "It always is," she said. The man stayed the night. He was a former Marine on his way back from Alaska to Michigan. They talked for hours on the porch, while the lake reflected the moon. It was the first night the house truly felt alive again. Autumn came slowly to Bluewater Point. The leaves turned copper along the hillsides, and the air grew sharp enough to make breath visible in early morning. One evening, Gideon stood alone on the dock, watching the lake darken into evening blue. He had his duffel bag beside him. The truck was packed again. This time the decision felt closer to real. Behind him, Valco lay on the porch steps, chin resting on his paws. The dog's eyes remained half open, watching both Gideon and the road at the same time. Evelyn stepped outside carrying a small lantern. The golden light brushed across her face, softening the lines of age and grief. "Are you leaving tonight?" she asked. Gideon looked out across the water before answering. "I thought I might." She nodded slowly. "That seems like something soldiers often say." He almost smiled. The porch light flickered on behind her. The lake turned dark and still as glass. From somewhere far down the road came the distant rumble of an engine. Gideon looked at the light glowing above the porch door, then at Valco, then at the quiet house standing beside the water. For the first time since arriving in Bluewater Point, the thought of leaving did not feel like freedom. It felt like walking away from something that had begun to matter. Evelyn held the lantern a little higher. "Stay for supper," she said. It was a simple invitation, but something about the way she said it made the lake, the house, and the quiet road feel different. Less like a stop along a journey, more like the place where a journey might finally pause. Gideon lifted the duffel bag from the dock. Then he set it back down again. Behind him, the porch light burned steadily into the evening, and for the first time in a long while, Gideon Cross wondered if Bluewater Point might no longer be a place he passed through. It might be the place he had been heading toward all along. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through people who choose to stand beside someone who has been left alone. In Bluewater Point, a mother waited for years with a light on her porch, believing that one day her son might find his way home. What she did not know was that God had already begun answering that prayer in another way. The man who arrived with her son's memories did not come to replace him, but he came at the exact moment when she needed someone to stand beside her. Through courage, truth, and compassion, that small house by the lake became something larger than grief. It became a place of healing. This is often how God works in our lives. Not always through dramatic signs, but through people, through timing, and through quiet moments when someone chooses kindness instead of indifference. A stranger who helps, a friend who stays, a neighbor who refuses to walk away when things become difficult. Sometimes the miracle is not that a life is restored exactly the way we hoped. Sometimes the miracle is that hope itself refuses to die. In our everyday lives, many people around us are like Evelyn. They are waiting for help, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to show them that they are not forgotten. And sometimes we are the ones meant to carry that light for them. Maybe God places us in certain places, at certain times, not by accident, but because someone nearby needs the strength we can offer. So if this story touched your heart, remember the lesson it carries. Keep your light on. Stand up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. Be the person who chooses compassion instead of silence. because you never know when your presence may become the miracle someone else has been praying for. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story touched you the most. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can hear them. Before you leave, take a moment to say a small prayer. May God watch over you and your family. May He guide your path when life becomes uncertain. May He place the right people beside you when you need them most. And may the light in your home never go out.